Chapter 1, The Angelus at the Wrong Hour. The town of Blue Hythe was one of those little English places that seemed almost too well arranged to be real, like a miniature in a glass case. It had one high street, modest but well swept, a modest market square where the pigeons behaved as if they owned the place, and a row of cottages leaning companionably into one another as though sharing secrets. On one side lay the sea, not grand or stormy, but always murmuring in grey tones like a tired but insistent conversationalist. On the other side stretched the downs, swelling green and drowsy under the horizon, as if England herself had stopped there to rest. Over all of it loomed the bell of St. Mildred's, the church's single but famous voice. The villagers said the bell was older than memory and truer than the compass. It had rung for weddings, for storms, and for the rare invasion of tourists. It had called fishermen back from the brink and children in from the fields. To doubt the bell was like doubting the sun or the price of bread. That was why, on the September evening when the Angelus tolled at the wrong hour, Blue Hythe stopped in its tracks. The effect was as strange as if the moon had risen at noon. The sky was bruised purple with the fall of dusk when the bell sounded, 3 heavy notes, like a cough in the throat of heaven, followed by a broken peal that stumbled and stammered into silence. Mrs. Plackett, who kept the bakery and who rarely looked up from her dough, froze with her floury hand suspended. The vicar, Reverend Calver, who had spent 30 years believing in punctuality, stared at his watch with genuine horror. Children stood still in their games, as if someone had changed the rules without warning. Only the sea continued in its murmuring, though even it seemed, for a moment, to hush. "Never in my life," Mrs. Plackett whispered, making a hurried sign of the cross though she would later deny it, "never has that bell lied." It was not long before the truth was discovered. A party of young men, led by Sergeant Blunt of the local constabulary, forced the oak door of the belfry and climbed the narrow stair that coiled like a snail's shell. At the top they found Dr. Julius Crane, dangling grotesquely from the bell rope, the very cord that had told his strange announcement. Crane was a man of learning and arrogance in equal measure. His broad shoulders and large head made him look rather like a Roman emperor in retirement, though his eyes were more calculating than imperial. He had come to Blue Hythe to lecture at the Philosophical Society on a topic titled, with typical bluntness, "The Ghost That Is Not There." His subject was the futility of faith, and his manner the futility of courtesy. That he should be found dead in the belfry, as if strangled by the very thing he mocked, seemed to the villagers like some vast joke of heaven. But the details were no joke. The oak door had been locked on the inside. The tiny lancet windows were too narrow to admit a man. No ladder or contrivance was near enough to aid escape. Crane's own heavy hand still clutched the rope as if refusing to surrender even to death. "Suicide," said Sergeant Blunt. He said it as one might say, rain, or tea at 4. His face, a collection of square bones, had little room for speculation. He came up alone, locked the door, tied himself off. End of tale. Most of the townsfolk accepted this with nods. They preferred simple endings, and Sergeant Blunt always obliged. Yet a small, round figure had also appeared among them, almost unnoticed at first, like a brown parcel placed in the corner. It was Father Brown. He had been drinking cocoa with Mrs. Plackett and gazing with peculiar tenderness at the sea when the news arrived. Now he stood in the belfry, his umbrella crooked over his arm, his eyes peering up at the dead man with the expression of a man observing an oddly hung picture. "I suppose he rang for help," Father Brown remarked gently, after a long silence. Blunt turned on him with irritation. "Help? The man's neck is broken. He wasn't calling for a doctor, he was doing the deed." Father Brown tilted his head. "People who call rarely wish to end things." When men cry out, it is usually because they hope someone will answer. It is only the silent suicides that succeed. Then why lock the door? The priest's round face crinkled in what might have been amusement or sadness. Perhaps he locked it to keep something out. Or, he added softly, to keep something in. Blunt muttered, parables, as though it were a swear word, and scribbled in his notebook. The others in the belfry, though, shifted uncomfortably. There was something about the rope, about the bell's cry at the wrong hour, that did not sit neatly inside the word suicide. Dr. Crane had been many things, arrogant, sneering, fond of humiliating opponents. But he was not the sort to stage a melodrama for the sake of his own death. Father Brown stood quite still, his short figure swallowed by the shadows of the tower, his umbrella tip-tapping the flagstones like a discreet question. His eyes, however, moved everywhere, the scuffed marks on the rope, the faint tar-like smear near the base of the door, the dust that clung to one rung of the ladder though none to the others. He said nothing more, but his silence pressed into the room as palpably as a sermon. Down below, the town was already fermenting with speculation. Some declared that Crane had been cursed for mocking heaven. Others insisted he had been haunted by the ghost he had denied. A few practical voices muttered of debts and scandal. But when asked directly, no one could name a single reason why Julius Crane would have sought death, except, perhaps, his pride. And pride, as Father Brown often said, is not so much a reason as a refusal of reasons. That night the bell did not toll again. The villagers, who had braced themselves for some further unnatural sound, were startled most of all by the silence. It hung over Blue Hythe like an unfinished sentence, heavy and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Father Brown took his leave of the belfry without any air of triumph or revelation. He merely looked once more at the dead man, then at the rope, and then down at the sea that glimmered faintly through the narrow window slit. To him, the case was less about a locked door than about a locked heart. And hearts, he knew, were rarely locked against themselves. As he descended the winding stair, his stubby fingers brushed again against the smear of tar. He rubbed it thoughtfully between finger and thumb. "The sea has visited the church," he murmured. "It often does, even when no one notices. But it usually leaves its footprints." Sergeant Blunt, following behind, demanded to know what he meant. But Father Brown only looked mildly surprised, as though someone had asked why birds sing in the morning. "Why? Nothing, nothing at all," he said. "I was only thinking how strange it is that a bell should call a man to his death when it has always called men to life. But then, perhaps bells are not to blame. They only speak when someone pulls the rope." And with that, the little priest shuffled into the night, his short steps swallowed by the shadows of Blue Hythe, while the townsfolk whispered and wondered whether the Angelus had tolled for a suicide, a crime, or something stranger still. Chapter 2, The House on the Hill. Tremaine House stood like an old aristocrat who had retired to the coast but still liked to be consulted. It had gables that frowned, windows that stared, and a long, sloping lawn that carried its dignity down to the very edge of the town. People said the Tremaines were the last reminder that Blue Hythe had once mattered, when smugglers ran rum and abbots rang bells against pirates. Lady Tremaine clung to that memory as tightly as she clung to her lace handkerchiefs, discreetly, but with an iron grip. When Dr. Crane's body was carried down from the tower, Lady Tremaine declared, in a tone that admitted no discussion, that the inquest must be held in her drawing-room. In her view, tragedy was no reason to neglect hospitality, and hospitality was best dispensed in surroundings that reminded everyone of good breeding. So it was that the company gathered in her high-ceilinged chamber, beneath ancestral portraits and among teacups thin enough to tremble at a loud remark. The sea could be glimpsed in a strip of grey through tall windows, but otherwise all was velvet, polish, and formality. The air was heavy with furniture polish and faint incense from a forgotten censer. Lady Tremaine herself presided from a high-backed chair, her figure slender but rigid, her hair pinned as if it too must obey her will. She did not speak of grief, she spoke of duty. The poor man, she said with a sigh as exact as a stage direction, must be honored in our town's memory, whatever his opinions. Around her sat the curious assembly of Blue Hythe's minds and misfits. Alastair Tremaine, her son, stood near the mantel, a young man with an elegance that seemed hinged, as though it could close with a snap into arrogance at any moment. His eyes, bright but weary, scanned the room with the detachment of a critic rather than a mourner. At the tea table, Miss Nora Vale stirred her cup but did not drink. A scholar of quiet repute, she was known for papers on medieval poetry, yet her thin face and restless hand suggested that she lived more vividly in books than in parlors. She had been seen conversing with Crane before, and now she sat with an air of someone waiting for her footnote to be questioned. Mr. Hobbs, the bell-ringer, occupied the least conspicuous chair, though his thick wrists and muscular forearms made him impossible to ignore. He looked like a man built for work, not conversation, and his attempt to handle china cups was like a navvy trying to tune a violin. He seemed ill at ease, muttering thanks for each offer of sandwiches as if each was an accusation. Sister Magdalen, a nun from the convent school at the edge of town, was there by Lady Tremaine's insistence. Her habit gave her presence a stillness that contrasted with the flickering anxieties of the others. Her eyes were clear, almost amused, as though she knew that both tragedy and tea would pass away, and that eternity was not impressed by cake. And finally, leaning back in his chair as if he owned philosophy itself, was Gideon Mark. He was a writer of paradoxes, famous at least within Blue Hythe for turning conversations upside down. If anyone could turn a death into an epigram, it was he. His long fingers fluttered with his words like quotation marks in the air. The coroner had not yet arrived, but speculation already served as entertainment. "It is a perfect irony," declared Gideon Mark, spreading butter with almost ceremonial flourish. "The man who denied spirits found strangled by one. For what is a bell rope but a ghost of iron and air? He mocked superstition, and superstition rang him out like a hymn." Lady Tremaine stiffened. "Mr. Mark, death is no place for jokes." "On the contrary," he replied smoothly. "Death is the best place for jokes. They cease to offend the subject." It was Sister Magdalen who interrupted with calm firmness. "Bells are not superstitions. They are practical. They are practical. They tell you when to pray and when to eat. If they sometimes ring at the wrong hour, that is usually the fault of men, not of heaven." Mark's smile faltered. He was unused to being contradicted by nuns. Perhaps. But men often use bells to summon illusions from the sky. They also use them, Father Brown said quietly, from the corner where he had been given a low stool, to summon help. Heads turned toward him with faint surprise. He looked entirely out of place in the aristocratic drawing-room, a short, shabby man with round shoulders, holding his teacup as if it were a tool rather than a treasure. Yet his voice, mild and unadorned, carried oddly far. "Help," echoed Alastair, with a smile that clicked shut. "You mean he rang for a doctor?" "A curious notion, Father." Brown shook his head. "I mean that when people are proud, they often wait until too late to cry out. But if they cry, they usually mean to live. The cry is a form of hope. That is why I wonder whether Dr. Crane really meant to die." There was a silence, broken only by the clink of Nora Vale's spoon. She spoke at last in a voice that seemed pulled out of her reluctantly. "He was not wicked," she said, her eyes fixed on the surface of her tea. "Only proud. Pride is like a ladder where one insists on being a rung higher than everyone else. After a while, the ladder wobbles. And when it falls, it does not matter that one is clever." Alastair gave a faint laugh. "If Crane fell, it was from his own ladder, not ours." Father Brown looked at him with his round, unreadable eyes. "People rarely fall from ladders of their own making. They usually stay there triumphantly, until someone gives the ladder a kick." Alastair's smile grew colder, but he said nothing. Mr. Hobbs shifted in his chair, his hands tightening around the fragile porcelain. "Dr. Crane weren't the sort to take kindness kindly," he muttered. "Always asking questions no one could answer, then laughing when we couldn't. But I never thought he'd, do it himself." Sister Magdalene folded her hands. "Men sometimes fight with heaven when they are really fighting with themselves. And sometimes with their neighbors," added Father Brown, still mild, still almost overlooked. The gathering rippled with unease. For the first time since the death, the thought of murder stirred in the air, faint but undeniable, like the distant tang of smoke before a fire. No one spoke it aloud, but each face seemed to tighten, as though silently wondering which of them might be called to explain more than they wished. At last, Lady Tremaine rose, tall and thin as a candle. "We will not," she said firmly, "give way to rumors. Dr. Crane is gone, and whether by his own hand or some accident, we must meet it with dignity. I will see that the church is dressed properly for the funeral." The others murmured agreement, half relieved, half resentful of her authority. Yet even as they rose to leave, they could not shake the feeling that the bell had tolled not only for a dead man, but for something more unsettling, a secret no one wanted told. As they filed out into the evening, Father Brown lingered at the window, looking down the long slope of the lawn to where the town lights twinkled faintly. He saw the church spire against the darkening sky, and above it the silent bell that had spoken too soon. His lips moved as if in prayer, but when Nora Vale paused beside him and asked what he thought, he only said, "It is a curious thing, Miss Vale. A bell cannot ring itself. Someone always pulls the rope." Chapter 3, The Locked Room and the Open Sea. Morning reached Blue Hythe like a careful housemaid, drawing back the curtains of cloud an inch at a time. The church of St. Mildred's looked freshly washed in the pale light, its flint walls beaded with last night's mist. A sleepy knot of townspeople hovered by the porch, discussing the same 5 facts as if new meanings might be wrung from them by repetition alone. Inside, Sergeant Blunt clumped about with the rights of a man who understood keys and knots and distrusted everything else. The belfry steps were as narrow as bad arguments, winding up in short, stubborn turns. Father Brown went up slowly, with the thrift of movement common to fat men and monks. Halfway, he paused, not for breath, but to touch the inner edge of a step where the whitewash had been newly bruised, leaving a crescent of raw stone. He rubbed the mark with his thumb and found it faintly gritty. At the top, the little landing opened into the bell chamber, plain beams, a shuttered slit of a window, the bell rope drooping like a tired stalk. The great bell itself brooded above, the clapper fixed and silent. Blunt pointed with his pencil as if conducting an orchestra. Door was bolted from within. Key in the dead man's pocket. No access by the window, too mean for a cat, unless it's a theological one. The rope bears the strain you'd expect. We've measured the drop. It'll hold a man aplenty. Suicide, with bells on. Father Brown peered at the rope as a tailor might peer at thread. The twisted fibers were darkened at 2 places, not 1, the lower band where a noose had bitten, and a second, higher bruise, slight but glossy, as if the rope had been drawn over a smoother edge than the beam itself. "Strange how ropes remember," he said. Blunt looked bored. "Ropes don't remember. People do." "That," said Father Brown, "is precisely the trouble." He crossed to the door. Its oak face wore scars from generations of weather and worry, but one scrape near the latch was bright and youthful. He set his umbrella tip to the mark and sniffed. There was a breath of tar and a ghost of oil, sailors' scents, not sacristans. "Fishermen have been mending nets," Blunt said, as if to shut the window Father Brown had opened. "Tar gets everywhere. It seldom climbs ladders by itself," the priest answered, mild as milk. They bent together to the floorboards. Dust lay in the corners with the patience of cats. But across the threshold had been dragged a thin, shining thread of something that had once been black and now was brown, a smear that narrowed to nothing, like a signature ending in modesty. "Coal," said Blunt, pleased to identify at least one thing. "And we've a coal merchant by the quay." "We do," replied Father Brown, "and we do not burn his coal. Blue Hythe keeps its toes warm with driftwood and thrift. Coal dust in a church is like a fur coat in August, not impossible, but it asks for conversation." A small cough announced the vicar, Reverend Calver, who hovered at the door with the posture of a man apologizing for the building. "If you must tramp," he began, and then, seeing the marks, amended hurriedly, "Yes, quite. Do tramp. Has anyone altered the fittings in the last month?" Father Brown asked. "Anything done to the bellstock or beam? A repairman, perhaps?" The vicar shook his head. "Only Hobbs, on the ropes now and then. He knows them as a cobbler knows laces." "Mr. Hobbs knows many useful things," murmured Father Brown, with no discernible meaning except the tone of a man counting blessings. They descended. On the way down, the priest paused again at the second turning, where a stubby iron peg stood driven into the wall, quite low, like a rung for a child. It was old iron, but the mortar around it showed a pale halo, as if it had been disturbed and reset. He pressed it with his palm. It took weight without complaint. He did not comment. Priests are trained to be sparing with alarms. They came out into the nave where light fell through clear glass and made the flagstones look honest. Sister Magdalene sat near the front with a group of small girls practicing a hymn without voices, moving lips in a whisper of discipline. She caught Father Brown's eye and gave him that brisk nod by which sensible women bless muddled men. "Is the bell to ring tonight?" she asked. "The bell will do whatever men make it do," said Father Brown. "Which is the difficulty of bells and men?" Blunt cleared his throat. "There's nothing to it," he announced to the church at large. "Door locked, key inside. Rope strong." The man had opinions and enemies. Perhaps he preferred a simple answer to both. Father Brown walked along the north aisle and stopped at the font. On its rim a pinch of grit lay like pepper. He frowned and dipped a finger. The granules were too smooth for beach sand and too sharp for mortar. He rolled them and smelled them. "Wharf dust," he said. Our visitor came straight from the quay and didn't stop at the tap. The vicar brightened. "Then we have a trail." "We have a trail," Father Brown agreed, "though I don't promise it stays on the ground." They took it to the quay. The harbor drowsed under a sky the color of pewter. Nets hung like tired cobwebs. Half a dozen boats floated with the indolent virtue of things that earn their keep at odd hours. On a bollard sat old Baines, a fisherman who had perfected the art of not moving while suggesting he might at any moment. "Morning, Father," he said. Heard your bell told lies last night. Bells seldom lie, said Father Brown. They are innocent instruments, like ink. It is the hand that writes the wrong hour. Baines spat neatly into the water. Aye. Well, we've had a deal of tar about. Young Tom Hobbs trod enough to pave a street. He and his uncle fetched a box yesterday from the chandler's. Looked like a rat trap, sounded like a bird. Where is the chandler's list kept? Blunt demanded, clapping officialdom upon the quay. In the chandler's head, said Baines, who did not hold with books that did not float. The chandler appeared, a kindly scarecrow smelling of rope and paraffin. Sold a pulley, I did, he volunteered before they could ask. Little traveling one, neat as a pin. Good for hoisting a dinghy sail or sending baskets from cliff to cliff if you're a boy with more courage than sense. Hobbs paid cash. Said it was to sweeten the ring. Sweeten the... Blunt began. Make the pull smoother, the chandler explained. Running lines sing with less temper if you give them a friendly wheel. Father Brown thanked him as one thanks a man for a sermon with only one heresy. He walked to the harbor rail and looked back up the hill to St. Mildred's. The line of sight was as clear as a commandment. From the Tremaine roof one might have tossed a well-thrown stone toward the church. From the church, the house looked almost near enough to borrow a cup of sugar. Do you ever rig a line across a gap, he asked Baines, so that a basket runs from one place to another? Not unless I mean to annoy Providence, said Baines. You need a start point higher than the finish, and fools to cheer. Fools can be found, said Father Brown. On their way up the hill, they met young Tom, guilty by the mere virtue of looking pleased with life. The tar had been scrubbed from his boots, but not from his soul, it clung to him in the manner of memories. Did your box squeak? Father Brown asked, almost as if offering him a riddle. Tom's grin blossomed, then withered under Sergeant Blunt's gaze. Uncle said not to chatter, he muttered. Then we'll be silent together, said Father Brown, and produced a currant bun from nowhere, which is a priestly miracle taught in seminaries that care for souls. Tom accepted confidence and cake in the order men usually do. They reached Tremaine House as the hour thinned toward noon. A gardener was clipping the yew with scholastic care, the clippings lay like dark notes on the gravel. Father Brown drifted along the terrace edge and found, 3 balusters from the end, a notch cut recently into the stone, shallow but smooth. Above it, the parapet showed the polish of rope burn, a pale kiss against the darker weathering. Do you see? He asked Blunt, who saw unwillingly. Something passed from here to there. Not a body, no, not boldly, but a weight, a messenger with no mind of its own. Blunt scowled. So someone strung a line to the church and sent, what? A halo? You're building bridges out of breeze, Father. Breeze built most bridges men deny, returned the priest, with good temper. Lady Tremaine appeared framed by the long window, a figure drawn in ink and reserve. She came out with the step of one who has practiced dignity and found it serviceable. Sergeant, Father, she said, inclining just enough to include both in courtesy, you are, I trust, getting closer to the end of this unhappy business. We are getting closer to the beginning, said Father Brown, bowing, which is the only road to ends. She accepted the oddity as one accepts a draft from a doctor, without liking it. Alistair is out. He will return for luncheon. Father Brown nodded. A fortunate hour. People tell the truth either before lunch, being empty, or after dinner, being full. The in-between times are reserved for eloquence. Back at the church, the noon that should have rung did not. The bell rope hung slack as a scolded tail. A hush settled over Blue Hythe that was not only acoustic. It was the sort of silence in which a village decides, silently, whom it likes and whom it will not forgive. Father Brown stood beneath the bell and looked up. The stained patch where the rope had rubbed over something smoother than oak seemed slightly longer now, as if the rope itself remembered the path and craned toward it. He set his hand to the rope, drew it down very gently, and let it slide. The fibers murmured over the worn place with a faint, singing friction, a sound almost like a string drawn once across a violin. "Listen," he said. "I hear nothing," Blunt declared. "That," said Father Brown, "is what concerns me." He sat at the base of the beam, small and self-contained, like a traveling chest that carries, in shabby order, all one needs. He turned his hat in his hands, not nervously, but as if consulting it. "A locked door is a boast," he said at last. "It declares that truth cannot come in. But truth, being unathletic, often prefers to come by a smaller way, a thread, a habit, a little wheel. Pride sets the bolt, ingenuity supplies the catflap." Blunt sighed. "We will collar Hobbs. He bought the pulley, his boots were tarred, that will do for starters." "It will do for starters," agreed Father Brown, "if you wish to arrest a beginning. But we must find the man who tied the last knot." The sergeant made a large, exasperated note in his book. Outside, the sea moved with its parental patience, gulls sketched white commas against the statement of the sky. And still the bell did not ring. The town felt it like a skipped heartbeat. Children paused at games, Mrs. Plackett paused at dough, the vicar paused at prayer. Father Brown rose, dusted his cassock with absent care, and looked from the dark beam to the bright slit of window and beyond it to the blue that had named the place. "We shall have the Angelus again," he said quietly. "But first we must discover who taught a rope to climb." Chapter 4, The Theology of Rope. The vestry smelled of iron and hymnals, a mixture that reminded Father Brown of all the parishes where human sorrow had been stored in wood and wax. Sunlight entered in reluctant stripes through narrow glass, striking the brass candlesticks with hesitant glints. The bell rope dangled through its hatch like the tail of some captive beast. Father Brown took the rope in his stubby hands, weighing it as though it were a moral argument. The hemp was coarse but strong, stained in places with the dark sweat of decades. "A rope," he murmured, "is a very moral thing. It insists on consequence. Pull at one end, and something must stir at the other. Sin is rarely so honest." Sister Magdalene, who had followed him in from the nave, folded her hands with serene patience. "And what of grace?" she asked softly. "What does that insist upon?" "Grace," Father Brown replied, turning the rope slowly, "is the only thing that lets go. It slackens the knot. It makes it possible to stop pulling." The nun nodded, her eyes bright with amusement and something deeper. "You see sermons in hemp, Father." "I see sermons in shoelaces," he answered, smiling faintly. "The world is never short of parables. Only of ears." They were joined by Nora Vale, pale as parchment, who slipped in almost apologetically. She looked not at Father Brown, nor at the nun, but at the rope, her lips pressed tight. After a moment she spoke, her words strained as if dragged from her. They found a verse in Dr. Crane's pocket. From the Psalms. "Deep calleth unto deep." Father Brown lifted his eyebrows. A strange souvenir for a skeptic. He despised scripture, Nora went on. He would never quote it, save to twist it. Yet they found it folded neat. That was no suicide's flourish. He mocked poetry too. Poetry, said Sister Magdalene gently, is sometimes the last voice of a man who has lost all others. Father Brown rubbed the rope again between finger and thumb. Poetry is a sign of life, not of death. And that line does not sound like despair. It sounds like a conversation. Calling is not the speech of the hopeless, but of the hopeful. Someone called, and someone answered. His round eyes traveled upward, tracing the rope to where it vanished into the shadows of the bell loft. He leaned close, nose almost brushing the fibers, and stopped at a patch darker than the rest. The stain was not old sweat, but fresh, darker, glossier. He tugged gently, and the rope shivered with a faint, unnatural smoothness. He craned up. There, hidden against the beam, was a small traveler, a pulley, screwed into the timber, so unobtrusive it could have been mistaken for a knot in the wood. The rope ran over it with ease. "Ah," Father Brown whispered, his voice as mild as if he had found a lost penny. So the rope climbed by itself. At least, it was taught how. Nora gave a sharp intake of breath. Then, it was not suicide? Suicide seldom brings tools, said Father Brown. This is contrivance. Contrivance is the child of intent. The nun bent closer, examining the tiny wheel. So the door could have been locked, yet the rope drawn from outside. Precisely, Father Brown replied. The lock kept out intruders, but the rope was free to obey whoever guided it. The pulley is a servant that works without knocking. Nora swayed slightly, clutching the edge of a pew. Then someone meant him to die. Father Brown's face was grave, but not unkind. Murder is only the last name we give to a very long chain of thoughts. But yes, someone tied a knot they knew would tighten. The vestry seemed to grow colder. The candles, though unlit, flickered in imagination with ghostly flames. Outside, the sea sighed against the quay, its rhythm like a breath too heavy to carry. Why would anyone wish him dead? Sister Magdalene asked after a pause. Oh, there are always reasons, Father Brown said gently. Money, malice, pride, even pity. But reasons are often disguises. The real thing is simpler, the hunger to be splendid, to prove right, to hurt without being hurt in return. Murder is often just pride with a rope. Nora looked at him sharply. You mean one of us? He met her gaze calmly. I mean one of us, always. The world is not killed by strangers. It is wounded by its friends. She turned away, biting her lip, and stared at the crucifix on the far wall. It seemed, in that dim light, less an ornament than a reminder. Father Brown stepped back from the pulley, dusting his hands on his cassock as though closing a book. There is our beginning, he said. We now must learn who gave the lesson. Chapter 5, The Woman at the Pump. The village pump was one of those instruments that belonged as much to gossip as to thirst. It stood squarely in the middle of the green, its iron handle worn shiny from generations of elbows. Around it news flowed more freely than water, and the splash of buckets was often drowned out by the clatter of voices. On the morning after the discovery of the pulley, Father Brown found Mrs. Plackett stationed there as if she had grown from its stone base. She was a broad woman, her apron as stiff with flour as her opinions were with certainty. She pumped with a rhythm that suggested each gush of water was accompanied by a judgment, and indeed she spoke between strokes with an air of law and prophecy. I never liked that Dr. Crane, Father, she declared, sending a jet of water arching into her bucket. You could tell by the way he looked at a loaf that he thought it was an accident. A man who sneers at bread is not to be trusted. Still, to go and hang himself like a side of mutton, well, it doesn't rise, if you'll pardon the word. Father Brown watched the stream trickle, glinting in the sunlight. No, he said quietly, it doesn't rise. Fish rise. Men are pulled. Mrs. Plackett sniffed, unconvinced by philosophy. Well, all I know is he was a man with no prayers in him. He got what comes to such. And if you ask me, we'd do better to let the sea wash him away and keep our hands clean. Hands rarely stay clean by washing them, Father Brown replied gently. They stay clean by not striking in the first place. Before Mrs. Plackett could muster a retort, a small figure slouched into view. It was Tom Hobbs, the bell-ringer's nephew, a boy with a freckled nose and a guilty shuffle. He stared at his boots as if they had been accused of crimes. "Morning, Tom," Father Brown said, with the bland cheerfulness of a man greeting a neighbor's cat. "Those are fine boots. They look as though they've been busy." The boy kicked at a pebble, revealing the black varnish of tar around the sole. Someone had tried to rub it off with sand, but tar clings with the loyalty of sin. "You've been down by the quay, then?" Father Brown continued, as if remarking on the weather. Tom shook his head, which is the way boys usually nod. "And did you carry anything home for your uncle?" Tom bit his lip. His eyes darted to Mrs. Plackett, who stood with folded arms, enjoying the show. Finally, in a voice that squeaked like a rusted hinge, he said, "A little box. Uncle said not to tell." It squeaked. Father Brown crouched slightly, so his round face was level with the boy's. "Squeaked? Like a mouse?" Tom considered. "Like a wheel." "Ah," Father Brown said softly, as if solving the puzzle of a nursery rhyme. "Like a pulley." The boy gave a reluctant nod. Mrs. Plackett pursed her lips until they nearly disappeared. "There now. Always some contraption or other. I told you Hobbs was too clever with his hands. The devil finds work for fingers that don't mind splinters." "Hobbs has strong hands," Father Brown agreed, straightening. "But even strong hands can be guided. Pulley or no pulley, they pull where they are told." He reached into his pocket and, with the quiet stagecraft of priests and conjurers, produced a bun dotted with currants. He offered it solemnly to Tom, who brightened as though granted absolution. "Thank you," the boy said, already chewing. When he had trotted off, Father Brown turned back to Mrs. Plackett. She looked triumphant. "Well, Father, if that doesn't prove it, I don't know what does. Hobbs fetched the very thing you've been hinting at. You mark my words, they'll clap him in irons before the week's out." Father Brown gazed at the pump handle, which glistened with water and smears of handprint. "The truth is heavier than a bucket, Mrs. Plackett. It cannot be carried by one man alone. And yet, often enough, the wrong man is left with it." She frowned. "You priests are always turning things upside down. If Hobbs did the deed, why not say so?" "Because," Father Brown answered, "it is not only what a man does with his hands that damns him. It is what he meant in his heart. And I think Hobbs meant less than his pulley performed." Mrs. Plackett muttered something about rope and responsibility, but Father Brown was already looking toward the church tower. Its silent outline stood against the clear sky, mute as a witness waiting to be called. He touched the brim of his hat and gave a little sigh. The boy carried the box, the man fixed the wheel, the rope obeyed. But it was another hand that tied the knot of intention. And it is intention, not tools, that weighs the soul. The pump gave one last groan as Mrs. Plackett filled her second bucket. Father Brown walked away, his cassock flapping faintly like a crow's wing, leaving behind the gossip of the pump and carrying with him the heavier murmur of conscience. Chapter 6: The Man Who Could Fly. The evening fell with a clear sky, the kind of pale blue that turns the sea into polished steel. Along the roofs of Blue Hythe, chimney pots cast sharp little shadows, and the gulls wheeled overhead like punctuation marks scribbled across the heavens. It was in this crystalline twilight that people first whispered of the apparition. A fisherman swore he had seen it, a figure moving between the Tremaine roof and the church spire, not walking exactly, nor flying quite, but crossing the air like a shadow stretched too far. A laundress insisted she saw a man floating as easily as her sheets billowed on the line. Children said it was a ghost, adults called it nonsense, and yet each retold it with the insistence of having witnessed something extraordinary. By the next morning, the town was thick with the tale. Blue Hythe was the kind of place that kept its mysteries polished as carefully as its brass doorknobs. But this one gleamed brighter than most, for everyone agreed on one thing: Dr. Crane had denied the supernatural, and now the supernatural had come striding over their rooftops as if to mock him. Sergeant Blunt, naturally, had no patience for it. "If people stare at roofs, they'll see monkeys," he grumbled. "And if they've been at the ale, they'll see angels. No more to it." Father Brown was less quick to dismiss. That same evening he walked the graveyard path beneath St. Mildred's Tower. The yews stood black and stiff, their scent sharp as medicine. He lifted his head, not toward the spire, but to the space between it and Tremaine House. His small ears caught a faint sound, so delicate most men would have missed it, a high, taut humming, as of a wire strummed by the breeze. He followed the note with his eyes. In the dusk he discerned the faint glimmer of a line, running from the Tremaine dovecot to a jutting balcony near the bell chamber. Along it slid a tiny wheel, a mere speck, but one that sang faintly when the wind pressed it. Father Brown sighed, the sound not of discovery but of confirmation. "So this is how men learn to fly," he murmured. "By making the earth pull for them." The next day, under a sky washed clear by rain, Father Brown examined the dovecot more closely. Its whitewash was cracked, and pigeons cooed inside with the solemnity of monks. But the beam nearest the roof bore a notch, and in it sat the stub of a hook, freshly polished by rope. On the grass below lay a scattering of feathers, as if the birds themselves had fled from the contraption. As he stooped to study it, a voice spoke at his shoulder. "Still chasing ghosts, Father?" It was Gideon Mark, his long figure lounging against the dovecot wall. He looked amused, as though he had come to watch a child build sandcastles. "One might think you believed the tales. Yet you, of all men, should know better." Father Brown brushed the dust from his cassock. "I believe in sin," he said. "That is modern enough. And I believe in tricks, which is older still." Mark's smile deepened, his eyes glinting. "Ah, but you are too simple. Men do not kill with pulleys and ropes, they kill with grander things, ideas, liberation, the very progress of the mind. Our poor Crane died because he chained himself to superstition. The rest is mechanics. Men kill," said Father Brown gently, "because they want to be splendid rather than sorry. Ideas are only ribbons they tie around the knife." Mark's laugh rang sharp, then softened as if he had caught himself. "You are incorrigible, Father. Always dragging the soul into it." "Where else should murder live?" asked Father Brown. At that moment Mr. Hobbs appeared, carrying a sack of grain over one shoulder. His face was ruddy with exertion, his hair damp. He stopped short at sight of them, nodded curtly, and shifted the sack with a grunt. Father Brown's eye, sharper than his manner, noticed the red wheels across the bell-ringer's palms. Raw rope burns, recent and angry. "Hard work, Mr. Hobbs," Father Brown remarked. "Aye," Hobbs muttered, not meeting his gaze. "Hard work keeps a man honest." He hefted the sack and trudged away toward the stable, his back stiff with more than labor. Father Brown watched him go, his face unreadable. "Yes," he said softly. "But it sometimes keeps him silent too." That night, the town spoke again of the flying man. Some swore the figure crossed once more between house and spire. Others denied it with equal passion. But in the vestry, Father Brown ran his hand along the rope that hung from the belfry, tracing the smooth path where it had sung over the hidden pulley. He closed his eyes, listening not to the bell, but to the faint echo of pride, fear, and secrecy. "The rope knows the truth," he murmured. "But ropes do not speak. Men must." Chapter 7, Confession Without a Box. The sea that morning had turned a pewter gray, restless under a thin wind that smelled faintly of salt and tar. Blue Hythe seemed quieter than usual, though in reality every cottage and shop hummed with speculation. The market square had become a tribunal of whispers. Sergeant Blunt, whose manner was more final than judicial, had already taken steps to arrest Mr. Hobbs. Hobbs himself stood hunched in the vestry like a man awaiting a storm. His rope-burned hands twisted against each other as though trying to untie a knot invisible to everyone else. When Blunt confronted him with the pulley, the tar, and the nephew's tale, the bell-ringer merely lowered his head. I fixed it," he admitted. His voice was gruff but steady. "Paid for the wheel myself, near enough. Thought it might ease the pull. But I never dreamt, God strike me if I lie, I never dreamt it'd be used so." Blunt's pencil scratched triumphantly across the page. "That will do for the jury." Father Brown, seated on a wooden chair by the wall, shook his head gently. "It will do for the law, perhaps. But for the soul it will not do at all." Blunt scowled. "The law is enough for me." "Then you will never catch more than half the truth," Father Brown answered, his voice mild as ever. "For the law punishes the hand, but the soul is poisoned by the thought that guided it." Later that day Father Brown made his way up the winding drive of Tremaine House. The great building seemed aloof, its stone face turned away from the sea as if preferring higher company. Alastair Tremaine was waiting on the terrace, standing like a figure from a portrait, elegant, assured, yet faintly theatrical. His smile, polite but brittle, carried that hinge which could snap into scorn at a moment's pressure. "You come to play confessor to our bell-ringer, Father?" Alastair asked. "I come," Father Brown replied, "to place the bandage where the wound is. And I don't think Hobbs is bleeding from the right place." Alastair laughed lightly, though his eyes did not follow. "Really, Father, you are incorrigible. A pulley, a rope, a guilty nephew, what more do you require?" Hobbs all but signed the thing. Father Brown leaned on his umbrella, looking not at Alastair but at the sweep of the sea. "What more?" "Only the truth, which is usually less convenient." Hobbs fitted the wheel, but it was not his quarrel that wound the rope. Something tightened in Alastair's face, like a curtain drawn a little too suddenly. "And whose quarrel do you suppose it was?" The priest's round eyes turned on him with the gentleness of a candle flame. "A clever young man's. One who wanted to humble Julius Crane for his arrogance, and perhaps for an insult flung too far. A young man who loved wit, loved theatre, and perhaps loved to play hero when only a friend was required." Alastair's smile faltered, then returned more sharply. "An amusing parable, Father. You speak as though you had proof." I am not trying to prove, Father Brown said softly. Proof is for courts. I am trying to understand where to put the absolution. Alastair's hands clenched at his sides. For a moment he looked not aristocratic but boyish, almost petulant. Crane published a letter, about Nora. He hinted at vile things. My mother was forced to endure his blasphemies in her drawing room. He deserved humiliation. That was all I intended, a harmless fright, a moment's terror to force him to apologize. But the rope ran too quickly, he fought, and then his voice broke into silence. He turned abruptly, gripping the stone balustrade of the terrace. Father Brown came closer, his step light for such a heavy man. Then pride made the choice. Pride always loads the dice, my son. In that instant you loved the splendid picture of yourself more than the dull truth. You let the rope run, and locked the door against pity. Alastair's face had gone pale. If I confess, he whispered, Hobbs is saved. If you confess, Father Brown answered, you are saved. Alastair laughed bitterly. Saved? You mean condemned? No, said the priest gently. Condemned is what you are already. Confession is the only rope that lifts instead of strangles. They stood in silence. From the terrace the view swept over the town and the harbor, tiny as toys below. The spire of St. Mildred's cut a sharp line against the sky, its bell mute but not forgotten. You cannot prove it, Alastair muttered at last, his voice hollow. I do not need to, said Father Brown. You already have. The young man flinched, as if struck. Then, slowly, he straightened, his shoulders squaring like a man preparing to walk into a storm. I will tell them, he said. Hobbs shall not hang for me. Father Brown's eyes softened. Better still, you shall not hang upon yourself. As they turned back into the house, the gulls wheeled high above, crying their harsh notes that sounded, to some ears, like laughter, and to others, like judgment. Chapter 8, Deep calleth unto deep. The Tremaine drawing-room had never held so much silence. Its polished tables, its solemn portraits, even the grandfather clock seemed to be holding its breath. Lady Tremaine sat rigid in her high chair, a figure carved of pride and porcelain. Nora Vale lingered by the window, pale but watchful. Sister Magdalen occupied a straight-backed seat with the serenity of one accustomed to storms. Mr. Gideon Mark leaned lazily against the mantel, though his eyes glinted with the anticipation of paradox. Sergeant Blunt stood by the door, notebook at the ready, impatient for facts that fitted neatly. Into this charged stillness stepped Alastair Tremaine. He carried no papers, no props, only his own face, which was ashen and stiff. He spoke without flourish, and that alone made his words more striking. I contrived it, he said. The pulley, the line, the trick. I lured Crane up the belfry with the promise of a private debate. I meant only to make him ridiculous, dangling in the air, begging for pardon for his insults to my mother and to Miss Vale. But he fought the rope, and the weight ran too far. In a moment of cowardice and pride, I let it run. The door I locked, not against intruders, but against mercy. Hobbs helped only by fixing the wheel, he did not know the purpose. His voice cracked, but he stood straighter, as if the truth itself supported him. Blunt's pencil scratched like a saw. This is an ugly business. It was a proud business, Father Brown said gently, and pride is always uglier than it looks. Mark could not resist. He let out a sharp laugh. So the priest will have us believe that a man was killed not by rope or wheel, but by pride. Next you will tell us the bell itself told him to death. Father Brown turned to him, his round face untroubled. Mechanics obey whatever hand pulls them. A pulley does not hate, a bell does not sneer. They are innocent things, like ink. It is always the thought that guides the hand. Murder begins long before the body falls. Nora Vale spoke suddenly, her voice trembling with more passion than anyone had yet seen in her. Dr. Crane wronged me. He wrote words that wounded my name. But Alastair wronged me more. I did not need a champion, only a friend. To turn me into the excuse for a spectacle, she broke off, biting her lip hard. Alastair bowed his head. I wished to be noble when nobility was not required. I wished to be splendid, when only honesty was asked. I see that now. Lady Tremaine stirred at last, her hand reaching for her son's arm. We will do what is just, she said in a voice steadier than her face. The Tremaines have always done what is just. No, said Father Brown, so quietly that all turned to hear. Justice is not enough. It is only mercy putting on boots. To do what is just is to give Alastair to the law. To do what is merciful is to remember that he is more than his sin. Sister Magdalene inclined her head. Justice without mercy is a door locked from the inside. Blunt shifted, uneasy with abstractions. The court will have its say, and that will be the end. Courts end cases, Father Brown replied. But souls do not end so easily. They go on carrying what the rope left behind. Confession is not for courts. It is for the man himself. Alastair's lips trembled. Then I am condemned. No, said the priest, his eyes warm with a strange weariness. You were condemned when you chose splendor over truth. But now, you may yet be forgiven. The word seemed to settle over the room like a bomb. Even Lady Tremaine, rigid as carved ivory, lowered her gaze, and her hand remained on her son's sleeve. Nora Vale, after a moment's hesitation, gave Alastair a small nod, not of reconciliation, but of recognition. Mr. Hobbs was summoned, his rough hands still red with rope scars. He stood bewildered as Alastair declared him innocent of intent. Tears welled in his eyes, which he wiped away clumsily with the back of his fist. I never meant, he stammered. Men rarely mean, Father Brown said kindly. They merely want. The grace is not in never wanting wrongly, but in admitting it when the want has led us astray. The inquest took its course. There would be years and punishments, penances and reckonings. But in Blue Hythe the healing began sooner than expected. For when the truth was known, even in its painful shape, the town breathed easier. The bell of St. Mildred's was rehung with a clean rope, and when it tolled the Angelus again at the right hour, children smiled and old men removed their caps. Father Brown, who believed in miracles because he had seen ordinary people, stood outside the bakery one evening as Mrs. Plackett presented him with a cake that could not quite decide whether it was pudding. Tell me, Father, she said, how did you know it wasn't suicide? Everyone else was sure. Father Brown smiled. Because suicide is silent. But Dr. Crane rang the bell. A man who calls out still hopes to be answered. And this Alastair, will he be forgiven? She pressed. Heaven forgives prodigals the moment they turn, Father Brown replied. As for men, they take longer, but are more talkative about it. Mrs. Plackett went away comforted in her brisk, practical way. Father Brown remained, watching dusk settle like a kindly cloak over the town. A gull wheeled across the violet sky, its cry harsh but honest. The sea glimmered beyond, murmuring deep to deep. The bell rang its proper number of notes at the proper hour. And Father Brown, small and shapeless in his brown cassock, folded his hands as if putting away a thought. Then he turned toward the presbytery, where Coco waited, and perhaps, in its humble steam, the quiet confirmation that mercy had begun its work.